Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. The President of the United States in these last hours defending the Affordable Care Act, getting very, very disappointing news from Wall Street Journal NBC poll. For the first time in the Obama administration, 2 terms, the president's negatives, which are very low, exceed his positives. And that points to the ongoing controversy over the Affordable Care Act, over the healthcare.gov website, over the conversation today between members of Congress and Kathleen Sebelius, the Secretary of the HHS, the confidence the American people have in their government right now, because this is a large, expensive, extremely complicated transformation of the American healthcare, a conversation to a government-run, government-mandated, ACA-approved healthcare package. We're seeing many cancellations, and there will be more in future. Full stop. We'll discuss this later on in the program. We're going to move to the governance of the other rising power on the planet right now. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com is here with me. Gordon, China's in trouble. And part of the trouble is economic, and we'll discuss that in a moment. But in these last days, there's a mystery on Tiananmen Square, which you've led me to understand is not allowed to be said on the internet or on Weibo or on any of the microblogs in China. You can't use the word Tiananmen when you associate it with the demonstrations in 1989. However, there's a new Tiananmen you can't say, which is, within these last days, a mystery. A vehicle crashing into the Forbidden City gate off of Tiananmen Square that is very close to the gigantic picture of Mao Zedong. That vehicle contained, at least now we're told, 3 people, a man, his wife, and his mother-in-law, dead in the fire. At the same time, there were tourists wounded, and now we're learning from the Associated Press filing on Al Jazeera and around the world that there are arrests going on in China, detentions. 93 Uyghurs are reported, according to the World Uyghur Congress, to have been detained without charge by the Chinese police. Is this panic from the government in Beijing, Gordon?
I think that it is panic because it's really they're casting their net very widely. They don't know what's going on. It's very interesting that right after the crash and the fire, they cleaned up the site immediately. There was no investigation. They scrubbed down the concrete. And that indicates that they're very sensitive about what happened.
We welcome now a man who's watched the Communist Party. Remember, this is not an elected leadership. This is the Communist Party. It has its own non-transparent rules. We welcome Richard McGregor, who is the author of the book, The Party, The Secret World of China's Communist Rulers. He's the bureau chief for the Financial Times in Washington. Richard, a very good evening to you. We want to discuss the third plenum, right, coming up, the reforms. But your comment on this crime, tragedy, mystery in Tiananmen Square, does it follow that this is about the suppression of the Uyghurs, the suppression of the minorities? Is this or is this instead an expression of the people's resentment and contest with the new leadership? Good evening to you, Richard.
I think from what we know, and we don't know everything obviously, is this is the long-standing grievance of the Uyghurs in Western China, ethnic that they're different ethnically from Han Chinese and of course Muslims who've long chafed against Chinese rule. And just to bring it home to our listeners here, this is kind of like somebody driving a terrorist vehicle or possible car bomb into the White House gates. He wasn't doing it at the presidential palace, and this the heart of power. So this would set the hairs on end of Chinese leaders, and as Gordon suggested, they're going to round a lot of people up.
All the Chinese leaders are gathering soon. Gordon, what is the third plenum?
The third plenum is a Communist Party meeting. It's going to be held in a week or so. And it is the time when new Chinese leaders traditionally unveil their economic agenda for their tenure. This year it's especially important because there's been a slowdown in growth, been very marked. And many people are saying that if there are reforms that are authorized by the third plenum, then growth should pick up again. And the question is whether the entrenched interests in China will permit the reforms that are necessary.
Richard, the word reform, is that a comfortable word for the Chinese Communist Party? Do they use it routinely? What does it mean to them?
Look, it's an institutionalized word in China. When Deng Xiaoping came along in 1979, his theme was reform and opening. So reform is always a good thing. But they're like politicians anyway. They prefer to say they're going to take a country forward rather than backwards. But there's been a lot of big build-up to this plenum, which is a full meeting of the top officials of the party, and frankly, a little bit of expectations inflation, as we say in a democracy. People are expecting big things out of it, and I suspect they might be disappointed.
Yeah, you've noticed a number of analysts recently have lowered their expectations. And as you point out, you go back a month, go back 2 months, they were very, very high expectations. I guess there's a sense, though, that the entrenched interests in Beijing are really going to prevent any serious restructuring of the economy. And that raises the issue of paralysis, which we've seen in a number of other instances. So, Richard, when you look at this, how do you view the plenum? Do you think it's going to really fulfill expectations, or do you think that it's actually just going to be a bust?
Well, without wimping out of it, it's going to be hard to tell when you read the mere communique, because they're going to sort of cover up their disagreements. They're not going to sort of parade their disagreements at the plenum in the final communique. And I think it'll give a vague sense of direction. It's all going to be in the execution. And I think basically it's not about so much opening the Chinese economy up to foreigners or global markets. There's a bit of that on the finance side. The big issue is whether they can open up all these industries dominated by the state, and there's a long laundry list of them, to local private enterprise. Will private enterprise be able to compete in areas like, power more, in banking, in transport, in ports, all these areas which the state has had a big hold on, people have created little fiefdoms there. They've got rich. Their families have benefited. They're like anybody else in the world. They don't want to give it up.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, because you look at this, and it means that if you have these entrenched interests dominating state enterprises, for instance, they're, as you say, they're not going to give up their power that they've accumulated because they've become fabulously wealthy. So many people have said that in China, you cannot have serious economic restructuring without fundamental political reform. And clearly, nobody in China right now, at least in the Communist Party top levels, is talking about political reform. That's completely off the table. And so, therefore, I've always thought that this plenum is just not going to produce the results that are necessary, because you're not going to see the political reform, which is fundamental to everything.
And Richard, interpret this. Is this an evolutionary process, and the Chinese have now come up and up to reach the oligarchical phase of European industrialization? Is that where we are? Family versus family, billionaire versus billionaire. It's not governance, it's not democracy, but it's better than blood feuds.
Well, that's a kind of nice way to put it, up to a point. I mean, it's not the oligarchical phrase, if I pronounce that correctly, like they have in Russia. At least, they haven't had a few individuals run off for the whole state in China, and China's had a much better mix of public and private and incentives. It's kind of a good thing you can make money in China, because that, helps the rest of the country. It's just got to the point now, though, where some of these entrenched interests, rather than, building the economy, are starting to sort of leech it. And that's okay if you're growing 10, 12% a year, and the cities are growing rapidly and the like. But, the Chinese know better than anybody else that they've kind of reached the limit of the old model. And they've got to take the punch bowl away from a few of the people who've been sort of getting merry on it for many, many years. The problem with, to go back to the point that Gordon was making, is the decision-making body, the plenum, the central committee, all these nice old Soviet names, all the heads of the state enterprises are also in there. They're also decision-makers in political reform, because they're big party officials. So there's a massive conflict of interest in trying to reform themselves, and that's one of the big struggles.
Richard McGregor is author of The Party, The Secret World of China's Communist Rulers. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com. I'm John Batchelor.